Welcome to the screencast for Improving Your Thinking by Stephen F. Barker. So in the last screencast, we learned about what several types of reasoning are. So remember that the generic word reasoning just means how your evidence relates to your conclusion. And we learned about inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, hypothesis assessment, and inference to the best explanation. Once we learned about the most common types of reasoning at the very end of the article, the authors mention how you might go about beginning to analyze an argument. So imagine you have a particularly complex news article in front of you about a subject you're not really familiar with, single-payer health care, or a war in a country whose politics you're not familiar with. And you want to see whether or not you should accept their conclusions. So you have analyzed it yourself, you have main conclusions and sub-conclusions and all of the evidence that tries to prove these conclusions. Now you want to figure out if the chain of reasoning from their premises to their conclusions is reasonable. How are you going to do that? How are you going to figure out if it's good or if it's bad? Well, one way is to look for logical fallacies. So, like in many fields, in philosophy especially, and I've mentioned this before and I'll mention it again, there's a word that in common usage is used in a really wide variety of situations, where in philosophy, it's used in a much more specific technical way. So if we say that reasoning is the relationship of premises to a conclusion, a logical fallacy is when they don't relate well to the conclusion. They might not be relevant, they might be contradictory. There are dozens and dozens of ways to make the reasoning suspect. And a lot of times we'll learn from observing mistakes. None of us are perfect, we're all fallible. We all err in our judgment. So we can recognize these mistakes of our own or of other people. And when we do this over time and we accumulate instances, you start to see patterns. So patterns of the most common errors in reasoning. And we can call those logical fallacies, the named ones especially. There are dozens of named ones and even more unnamed ones. But when we see them over and over again, it'll make it easier to spot when someone makes it, the fallacy or the error, and to avoid making it ourselves. So this article by Stephen Barker provides 4 examples of some of the most common errors in reasoning or common fallacies. So the first one we talk about is circular reasoning. There's the Latin name for it. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it properly. It can also be known as begging the question. So this is the formal definition of circular reasoning or begging the question, is when you assume the truth of your conclusion in your premises. Or another way to put it is when the argument fails to prove anything because it somehow takes for granted what it is supposed to prove. So for any sacred text, if you say, I have to obey it because it's the word of God, and then somebody says, well, how do you know that? And they say, God says it in the document. That is circular reasoning. There are various more specific forms of circular reasoning. One of them is the complex question, where you lump in multiple questions together into one statement. So you force controversial claims alongside acceptable ones. So the most well-known example of this is a cop is questioning a suspect and he says, when did you stop beating your wife? And that obviously assumes that the suspect had been engaged in beating his wife prior. So no matter what he answers, sounds like he's incriminating himself. It also doesn't have to be that dramatic of consequences. Say you're going to distant cousin's wedding in a few weeks, and you run into a friend of the family, and you might ask them, are you going to Carol's wedding and her reception, and are you bringing them a gift? So you put in 3 things at once where you can't really, or maybe not necessarily, answer all with one yes or one no. The next one also has multiple forms. Ad hominem, where you attack the speaker instead of the argument. This one happens very, very frequently. So remember, I keep stressing that we have intellectual values, where we are all above board and we're all aimed at the same goal, which is getting the closest to knowledge that we possibly can. We assume that other people are acting in good faith when we really try and debate a position with them. Alongside that, which I haven't mentioned yet, and I'm surprised, it's something called the principle of charity. If you really want to get to the truth of the matter, and maybe your opponent is a little bit weaker in their process of reasoning than they could be, a lot of people will take that chance to destroy the person themselves or the weak argument that the person is putting out. And that the second part, of course, isn't the worst strategy. You're still attacking the argument. But if you're really trying to get to truth, you want to make sure you consider all relevant evidence. So you want your opponent's argument to be as good as it can be. And that's where the principle of charity comes in. You try and reconstruct your opponent's argument to the strongest form it can possibly be in. Because if your position can beat that position, then your conclusion is even stronger. And if we're all in good faith and we're all trying to get to knowledge, that's the best outcome for everyone. If you commit the fallacy of ad hominem, however, you are not subscribing to this good faith policy whatsoever. You just want to win the argument, like the sophists. So there are instances wherein somebody who is an abhorrent human being, your values and their values might be directly opposed. That doesn't mean that every argument that they come out with is going to be logically unsound. And you need to take the premises and the conclusions as they are, no matter who is saying them, and see whether or not they hold up that way. So if someone says, you should really drink less, you're exhibiting some of the behaviors of alcoholism, and you turn around and say, oh, but you're the person who had a bottle of wine last night, you are committing the ad hominem argument, specifically the poisoning of the well. You don't really have to know the specifics, just know that ad hominem is attacking the speaker instead of the argument. Black and white thinking is when you assume that there's a logical connection between 2 options when there are no such connections. And there's another sort of cliched example of this one. Say you serve your spouse a bowl of soup, a bowl of soup, and they try it and they say, oh, it's so hot, I can't eat it. And then you say, well, what do you want it, ice cold? That's assuming that it's an either or, black and white situation. And of course, most people would prefer their soup somewhere in the middle. So one way to analyze arguments is to look for those fallacies and correct them, of course. Also remember that when we were talking about one way to reject even deductive arguments, if something was ambiguous or vague, you could reject it outright without even knowing the truth of the premises. And this is sometimes called a semantic argument. So when we want to sharpen our others or make clear somebody else's argument, we can think specifically about the definitions of the words that we use. There's several different kinds of definitions, and sometimes one or the other will suit our purposes better. The three kind of definitions our author talks about are analytical, stipulative, and revelatory. Analytical definitions can be called dictionary definitions. They're intended to describe the meaning of whatever word it is that's already in widespread use. So if one of these kinds of words has multiple uses already in widespread, then you would specify which definition you're referring to when you use it in an argument. These kinds of definitions can't be too broad because then they're automatically vague and ambiguous, which we're trying to avoid. They also can't be too narrow because then they'll exclude things that actually belong into that definition. They don't capture the correct definition of the meaning. Let's see what example our author uses. Too narrow. To define psychosis as schizophrenia would be too narrow because there are other kinds of psychoses. Make sense? Stipulative definitions. So scientific reports often use definitions like these, wherein you tell your audience exactly what you mean by word X. They might have a phrase like, when I use the word X, I mean Y. And when we see a stipulative definition, you don't have to agree with it, but you can just accept that this is what the author means when they use this word. So then you can see if you buy it, if you just buy into their definition, does their definition logically interact with the evidence and conclusion as presented? So it's all a part of analyzing arguments as charitably, clearly, and well as we can. So this book has an example of a stipulative definition regarding sanity. This is on page 56, and it's a counterexample. So just because you can stipulate definitions doesn't mean you should take a common word and give it a weird definition. Smith says, General Green is insane, you know. He ought to be dismissed. And Jones says he is. I agree we shouldn't have insane persons serving in the army, but how do you know he's insane? Smith says, it's obvious. He believes in ESP, and according to my definition, since I'm entitled to use words as I please, anyone who does this is insane. So that's counterproductive, and there's no black and white way to say when stipulative definitions stop being a useful tool and start to be manipulative rhetoric, but knowing that it's a possibility hones us in when someone uses a stipulative definition so we can weigh the evidence in each case. My example is, say that you're writing about love for whatever reason. It could be in a poem or for a report in biology. But love can mean platonic love, sexual love, romantic love, love for your family. And you might choose to stipulate that when you're saying the word love for your purposes, you mean only the emotion that one feels when they claim they're in romantic love. That might even be more the previous analytical definition. I'm going to have to think about that. But all you need to know is when you stipulate a definition, you say X means Y, and that's exactly how I mean it every single time I use it, so as to be as not ambiguous as possible. Revelatory definitions. So the two previous kinds of definitions are all about the way we use words already. But sometimes we want to capture a new concept or a new feeling. And how do we do that? We might invent a word. We might create an analogy to something people are already familiar with. Or we might expand a definition of a word that already exists. Our author has an example on page 57 where, let's see, a 19th century writer defined architecture as frozen music. He wasn't trying to describe how the word architecture is used in our language. Nor was he proposing some arbitrary new usage. And you shouldn't censure his definition on the grounds it's unhelpful for preventing ambiguity. It's not the purpose of this kind of definition. It's a metaphor, and it suggests a new way of looking at architecture. So the conclusion. One reason that it's important to focus on definitions, I've mentioned a little bit earlier, is the common problem in argumentation where people say, oh, we just have semantic differences. If you pay careful attention to how you're using language in your arguments, that will hopefully happen less often, and it will also help you get back to the so-called substantial claims, even though, of course, verbal disputes sometimes have meaningful differences as well. And I found this online, a short primer to a lot more logical fallacies, ones that are very, very common. The straw man, the slippery slope. Some of them are logical fallacies because they demonstrate that the premises or the evidence isn't relevant to the conclusion. Or, let's see. That people didn't consider rebuttals, so you only looked at a tiny piece of the puzzle. Or if the structure of your argumentation is completely off, like if you contradict yourself, or if there's just not enough evidence. I mentioned this in a few, I think a couple of the screencasts previous, wherein if you want to teach a child something like what the color red is, you don't need a whole lot of evidence. If their eyes are working within normal parameters, you can show them something that is red, and that is enough proof. Whereas if you're trying to make a big claim about the world or about yourself, you're going to need more nuanced argumentation and a wide variety of evidence. So this concludes our screencast on Stephen F. Barker's Improving Your Thinking.